In the world of statistics, there is a concept known as the black swan, an event so improbable that it cannot be predicted, yet so powerful that it shifts the entire course of history. What happened to Tsutomu Yamaguchi lies beyond even that theory. Imagine a map of Japan in August 1945. Two cities separated by hundreds of miles, two targets, two bombs that would forever change the face of warfare. The probability of a single human being standing within the lethal radius of both blasts and surviving is roughly 1 in several billion. It is the equivalent of being struck by lightning twice in the same week while standing in two different cities. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was not a war hero in the traditional sense. He was not a politician nor a soldier. He was an engineer, a man of blueprints, calculations, and steel structures. Yet it was his body that was destined to become a living testament to the fact that humanity had created something capable of competing with the power of the sun itself. Today, we follow Tsutomu's journey second by second, from a peaceful breakfast in Hiroshima to a hospital bed in Nagasaki. This is a story of how the fragile human spirit proved to be more resilient than concrete and steel. August 6th. Hiroshima woke up to the accompaniment of unbearable heat and humidity. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old employee of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, was finishing a 3-month business trip. He was a specialist in designing oil tankers. On this day, he was finally supposed to go home to Nagasaki. In his suitcase were gifts for his wife, Hisako, and their young son, Katsutoshi. He imagined opening the door to his home, smelling the familiar scent of his wife's cooking and holding his child. These thoughts warmed him more than the morning sun. At 8 a.m., Tsutomu was already on his way to the shipyards. But suddenly he realized he had forgotten his hanko, his personal signature stamp, and his travel documents at the office. Without them, he couldn't board the train. He apologized to his colleagues and turned back. That short walk back toward the office would become the boundary between his old life and hell. At 8:15 a.m., Tsutomu looked up and saw a lone American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, silver and gleaming in the sky. There was no panic. The city was used to weather planes. Tsutomu squinted against the sun, watching as a small parachute detached from the belly of the plane. Strange, he thought. Why are they dropping a parachute? In the next heartbeat, the world ceased to be material. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a light. Magnesium white, supernatural. It shone through his closed eyelids, revealing the bones of his hands as he instinctively shielded his face. The Japanese call it pika, the flash. Tsutomu managed to dive into a roadside ditch. Only then came the dawn, the boom. The air turned into a solid wall. A shockwave, traveling at the speed of sound, roared over him, ripping trees out by their roots and grinding brick houses into dust. Tsutomu felt himself being lifted and spun like a dry leaf in a tornado. When he opened his eyes, the sky was black. Not with clouds, but with ash. His left ear heard nothing but an endless whistle. The left side of his face and arms were screaming in pain. He looked at his skin. It was hanging in long, gray tatters, revealing raw, weeping flesh. He did not yet know that he was only 3 kilometers from the epicenter of the Little Boy blast. Tsutomu rose to his feet. What he saw was impossible for the human mind to comprehend. The city where he had just been walking was gone. In its place were only the charred skeletons of concrete buildings, looking like the ribs of prehistoric beasts. He staggered toward the shipyards, hoping to find his colleagues. Along the way, he encountered the antwalkers, survivors burnt beyond recognition, walking with their arms outstretched to prevent the raw skin from rubbing against their bodies. They didn't scream. They had no strength left for sound. Yamaguchi eventually found his colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyoshi Sato. They were alive, though similarly wounded. Together, they decided they had to reach the railway station. The only path lay across the Oda River. The bridges were destroyed or choked with debris. The river was the only way. But the water was hot and it was filled with bodies. Thousands had jumped in seeking relief from the heat, only to find death. Tsutomu later recalled having to literally push floating bodies aside to swim to the other bank. The rational engineer in him died in that river. All that remained was a primal, animalistic urge to survive and get home. By some miracle, a station on the outskirts was still functional. In the pitch darkness of the night, a train arrived. It was not a normal train. It was a ghost train, packed with shadows. People sat on the floors, in the corridors, on the roofs, without lights, in a tomb-like silence. Tsutomu squeezed into a carriage. All night, the train crawled toward Nagasaki. He stared out the window at the glowing embers of Hiroshima and thought, "The worst is over. I am going home. It is safe there." On August 8th, Tsutomu arrived in Nagasaki. The city greeted him with an eerie calmness. Here, people were still buying groceries, going to the cinema, and believing in the empire's eventual victory. When he knocked on the door of his home, his wife, Hisako, screamed. She didn't see her husband. She saw a mummy. His head was completely wrapped in filthy bandages, one arm hung limp, and his skin was blackened. He spent the evening telling her what had happened, but even she, his loving wife, listened with disbelief. A single bomb destroyed an entire city. It sounded like the fever dream of a shell-shocked man. On the morning of August 9th, despite his family's pleas and his agonizing pain, Tsutomu went to work. At Mitsubishi, discipline was paramount. 11 a.m. The company office. Tsutomu is sitting in the office of his supervisor, Mr. Okada. He is trying to report on the destruction of the shipyards in Hiroshima. "Yamaguchi-san," Okada said skeptically, adjusting his glasses. "You are an experienced engineer. You know that what you are describing is technically impossible. How can one shell evaporate concrete docks? You need rest. You have a fever." Tsutomu opened his mouth to protest. At that exact moment, at 11:02 a.m., the window behind him erupted with that same blinding, unearthly light. "Again!" Tsutomu screamed, diving to the floor. It was unbelievable. It was statistically impossible. But Nagasaki was turning into Hiroshima at that very moment. The Fat Man bomb had detonated over the Urakami Valley. This time, Tsutomu knew what to do. He pressed himself to the floor, shielding his head. The shockwave blew out the windows, turning the office furniture into splinters. If he had been standing, he would have been shredded by glass. The Mitsubishi office was 3 kilometers from the epicenter. The hills of Nagasaki partially shielded them, but the destruction was still catastrophic. When the dust settled, Tsutomu stood up. His bandages had been blown off by the wind. The wounds on his face were bleeding again. He looked out the window. Over his hometown, a second nuclear mushroom cloud was slowly rising into the sky. Shortly after the blast, rain began to fall. But this was no life-giving water. It was black rain, a mixture of radioactive ash, soot, and water. The drops were sticky and left dark stains on the skin. Tsutomu began the walk home, certain that his family was dead. But fate, which had been so cruel, showed mercy. Hisako and their son had survived. At the moment of the blast, Hisako had been out. She had been looking for ointment for Tsutomu's Hiroshima burns. When the bomb exploded, she found cover in a tunnel. Her husband's wounds from the first bomb had saved her life from the second. The following years were a struggle for every breath. Tsutomu lost all his hair. He vomited constantly, suffered from high fevers, and his wounds refused to heal. Doctors didn't understand radiation. They simply waited for him to die. But Yamaguchi lived. He didn't just survive. He became a symbol. For a long time, he remained silent about his ordeal. He worked as an interpreter for the American forces and raised his children. Only in his old age did he realize that his life was a debt to those who never returned from the ash. He became the first person officially recognized by the government as a Niju Hibakusha, a double bomb victim. His body was a living map of 2 catastrophes. In 2006, he stood before the United Nations and said, "I have twice seen what no one should ever see. It is my mission to ensure that you never see it." Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away in 2010 at the age of 93. The man whom the most terrifying weapon in history tried to destroy twice died of old age in his own bed. Tsutomu's story is not a story about war. It is a story about how, even when the world collapses twice, a human being can find the strength to stand up, walk home, and keep living. Because life is the only thing that can stand against death. even when death falls from the sky on a small parachute.